All right, we are here for the second half of our section on censorship, and we're going to talk about free speech and freedom of information in this one. So we got to start with John Stuart Mill, who, if you remember from previous sections, is one of those big liberal guys, i.e., the nature of mankind is peaceful. They just want to do these voluntary transactions. It's government's job to kind of make sure those transactions are abided by and contracts are followed, but minimal government outside of those things. So he comes up with 4 reasons why freedom of speech is so incredibly important. Number 1, the thing that you want to censor might turn out to be true, right? There have been a lot of cases where unpopular speech turned out to be true. Second, even if it's not true, it might have kind of a core of truth, right? I was watching an episode of Brooklyn Nine-Nine last night, and they were trying to find this escaped convict, and they got a crazy guy who comes in and says, "Oh yeah, the underground lizard people and blah blah blah," and they were like, "Oh, God, he's nuts. He doesn't actually know where this guy is." And then he said, "I saw them going down into the lizard people lair," and one of them was like, "He went into the sewers." And so, even though this guy was nuts, and there was there aren't actually lizard people living underneath New York City, what he said had this core of truth, that he saw this missing fugitive go down into the sewers. 3, even if it's completely false and doesn't have that core of truth, it needs to be challenged. We need to point out that it's wrong. We need to make sure and publicly say that is wrong, in order to make sure that people understand why it's false, right? And 4th, the very act of challenging a true statement kind of helps unite theory and action, right? So it's not just what we should do, it becomes what we do, right? We take that truth, and by challenging that truth, we link the theory of what's right and what we should do to what is actually right and what we should do. Make sense? Okay. This causes problems. Freedom of speech is constantly something that we struggle with, especially in the United States, but also around the world. And there is a debate going on, and probably will go on for the foreseeable future, about what speech should be allowed and what shouldn't. And I think we can all agree that, the classic example of fire in a crowded theater should not be allowed because it causes panic and people get hurt. Direct threats to somebody should not be allowed. Credible threats and terroristic, I'm going to come kill you, should not be allowed. Harassment and stalking should not be allowed, right? But where exactly do we draw that line? There was a famous kind of debate in England and Britain in general, when it comes to the British National Party. And the British National Party is this kind of very right-wing, very racist, very, all Muslims are bad people, and no refugees, and England is for white people, and, all these kind of very, very nationalistic views. And the vast majority of the country thinks they're nuts. But there's a debate on whether they should be allowed to say the kind of things they're saying. And one side says, we need to hear them so we can ridicule them. We need to know what they believe so we can say, you're wrong. If somebody says, "Oh, believe these horrible things about Muslims," we need to be able to say, "Oh, well, then I'm not going to shop at your business because, I don't agree with you and your racist this and blah," whereas the other side says, no, we really shouldn't let them speak because this is harassment. This causes a tangible harm to the groups that they're speaking against. And if we give them the oxygen of publicity, they're going to spread their message and get more people to join their horrible nationalistic crusade. here in the United States, we have a very similar thing, where these usually kind of far-right, very, everything from racist to xenophobic to nationalistic to, all these other really horrible qualities, people want to speak on college campuses. And again, on the one hand, you have the people saying, look, they're wrong, they're stupid, they're horrible people, but we should let them speak because A, freedom of speech, B, we need to know what these bad people are saying so we know how to kind of work against it better. We know how to prove them wrong, right? There's this marketplace of ideas, and we need to win in the marketplace of ideas, not kind of not let the other side play, if that makes sense. And then on the other side, there are people saying, but so yes, they absolutely have the right to free speech, but what happens when that right to free speech violates the rights of some students to be free of harassment and the right of some students to have equal access to education? If I'm an African American student and I'm going to a university and that university invites someone who thinks I'm subhuman to come speak, I'm not going to, that's causing a tangible harm and makes me not want to access that education and restricts my access to education and will make me feel harassed and like I'm not as respected as a student as my colleagues of other races. So at what point does your freedom of speech violate the rights of other people to the point where you are no longer free to make that speech, at least in that place and that time? Does that make sense? That's kind of the current argument going on in the United States right now about these college campus speakers around the country. Another great example is this guy named Alex Jones. Okay. Alex Jones runs this website called Infowars.com. Don't go there. It is a wretched hive of scum and villainy. And he is a very, very well-known conspiracy theorist. And I'm actually from the same city he is in Austin. I remember watching him on Austin Cable Access TV in the early 90s. And he was nuts even back then. But he's, a proponent of tons of these weird, loony conspiracy theories. But recently he's gotten in trouble because he was very adamant after the Sandy Hook shooting, where a guy walked into an elementary school and killed a whole bunch of elementary students and teachers. He claimed on his show multiple times that it was fake. It's all fake. These grieving parents are actors and blah, blah, blah. And his listeners or his viewers started harassing the parents of these dead children, which is, I hope we can all agree, really, really horrible thing to do, right? I mean, these people have had their children murdered in school, and now they're getting harassed by these conspiracy theorists who think they made it all up. That's horrible. So, kind of as I'm recording this, he's on trial for essentially violating the rights of one of these parents to not be harassed and demeaned and abused and all those things. And I try to keep my personal opinion out of these lectures, but I really hope Alex Jones loses. He's a total idiot. But freedom of information is very related to freedom of speech, right? Because freedom of speech is how we transmit this freedom of information. And freedom of information is an incredibly, incredibly important thing, right? We can't know things and make decisions about things and vote and do all the things that a good citizen is supposed to do, or even a good human is supposed to do, without the information available to us that we can base those decisions and actions and votes and all those things on, right? When a government wants to oppress a population, the first thing they make sure to do is control information. which is why it's very, very important that not only do we seek out as good citizens of the world, as good humans, as good political beings, we need to make sure not only are we searching out information, but we're searching out the truthful information, right? Because bad information is, in a lot of cases, worse than no information at all. So we need to find those sources that are giving us the true information, focus on those, and ignore the ones that are giving us the bad or misleading information, and focus on knowing as much as we can so we can be good humans, good citizens, good voters, all those things. Perfect example of how this works, Tiananmen Square. Back in the late 80s, there was an uprising in China. It's called the Tiananmen Square Uprising. It was a big riot, college students very upset at the repressive Chinese regime. And that's where this famous picture comes from. I'm sure you've all seen this before. It's one guy standing there with a couple of grocery bags, stopping this entire line of tanks, right? In the picture, there's only 3, but there are other pictures that show kind of a zoomed out view, and there's like a whole line of tanks all heading down to the square to stop this riot. And this one guy just stands there, just stops them. And the tank tries to move around, and he gets right in front of it again. And that one guy kept this entire line of tanks busy for I don't know how long, but it was a hugely symbolic gesture where one guy was able to hold back the entire might of the Chinese government from going to intervene in this Tiananmen Square thing. In the United States, most of us have heard of this. In China, the government completely suppresses all information about the Tiananmen Square incident. They control the internet, they control the TVs. Like, no mention of that incident is allowed on the internet, on the TVs, on the radios, and the newspapers, nothing. They're trying to control the information about these demonstrations in order to control their populace. In a similar way, here in the United States, there's an issue called net neutrality. And this gets kind of technical, so a lot of people don't want to understand it or put forth the effort to really understand what's going on with this. But John Oliver, if you haven't seen John Oliver's HBO show, brilliant, brilliant show. It's kind of news but comedy, kind of like The Daily Show. But he did a great section on net neutrality that explains it very simply. And here's the really, really basic explanation of net neutrality and how it relates to freedom of information. When you transmit data over the internet, like you're watching this right now on a streaming service, and the data is going from their servers to your computer, but it doesn't go there in one long stream. Essentially, it gets the messages get cut up into these teeny tiny little chunks called packets, right? At the top of each packet it says, hey, I'm from YouTube and I'm going to this address, which is your computer's address. And it gets shuffled along from computer to computer to computer to computer until it finally reaches you. And this could be 5 different computers that it goes through. It could be 10, it could be 20. Doesn't matter. The point is, every time it reaches a new computer, a new server somewhere out there on the internet, that computer looks at the packet, says, oh, this is from YouTube, it's going to Bob Smith's computer, I'll send it that way. Like a post office sorting letters, right? All these computers, these servers, they just send these packets down the pipe that they're supposed to go down. And eventually it gets to you. Your computer gets all the packets in the message, puts them all back together, and then delivers to you the thing that you've downloaded from the internet. Whether it's this video or MP3 that you're downloading from the internet or a picture that you're going to a website to find. Everything gets cut up into these little tiny chunks called packets, and those packets will go through a bunch of different computers on its way from the source to you. Okay, that's how the internet works 101. Now, for a long time, for a long time, the internet by tradition was neutral, meaning that every computer between whatever source you're talking about and you treated every packet the same. no matter what it contained, no matter where it was from, no matter where it was going to. Every packet got the same kind of priority, right? So whether the packet was this video from YouTube or a picture of my Houston Texans on NFL.com, or a picture of Britney Spears on MTV.com. Every single packet that contains that information, no matter what it contained, no matter where it was going to, they all got treated the same. Then, 10-ish years ago, these internet service provider companies realized that there was no law requiring them to do that. So they started messing with priorities in order to get what they wanted. So there was an instance where Comcast and Netflix were trying to put together a new contract. And so you can watch as the Netflix traffic over time got slower and slower and slower, because Comcast's servers, if they saw a packet from Netflix, it would treat it with lower priority than all the other packets it was dealing with. So if you're a Comcast customer, your Netflix was getting slower and slower and slower and slower until they finally agreed on a new contract, and then Netflix speed shot back up to normal again. This was a blatant violation of net neutrality, which had been tradition since the beginning of the internet. But there was no law requiring it. So then the Obama administration, the FCC under Obama, said, no, that's not okay. We're going to make net neutrality official. We're going to make the law. You have to treat these packets the same, no matter their source or destination or content. Then one of the first things Trump did when he was elected is get rid of those rules. Now, as I'm recording this in 2019, net neutrality is not the law. And once again, we're starting to see these internet service providers messing with the priority of traffic in order to kind of get what they want. And the big fear is that they're going to use this power to violate your freedom of information, right? So let's say Comcast really doesn't like your favorite news source. Well, with net neutrality, they can just block any of their customers from reaching that news source. They can block all packets from that source going to any destination on any of their networks, which essentially means that you can't watch your favorite news channel anymore or go to their website because your internet service provider has decided they don't like it. That's the big fear. So net neutrality is an incredibly important freedom of information tool that it's, if you like freedom of information, if you like going to any website you want, any time you want, and having the ability to choose where you go and what you do on the internet, net neutrality is very important, okay? Next thing, the Freedom of Information Act. Many countries have very similar things, but the United States has had one since, I think, the 70s. Where any kind of non-classified government document, you as a citizen have the right to request that from the government. And they have the choice of either to give it to you or to kind of prove to a judge why they shouldn't, right? So if it contains, like, national secrets, it's, without CIA undercover operatives or something, they're obviously, the judge is going to say, no, you don't have to give that to them. But unless they can specifically articulate to a judge a reason why they shouldn't have to give you this information, they are legally required to give you these documents. And that's a big deal, right? We're able to go to our government and say, look, we want to know this and that. We want to know these senators, what happened in this meeting, right? We want the transcripts of this meeting with these senators. We want, your report on the safety of motor vehicles. We want to see the entire report. And unless the government can articulate some valid reason why people shouldn't be able to see it to a neutral judge, they have to legally give it to you. That's very good. Today, freedom of information is not about, it's not necessarily, our big fear is not necessarily that the government will prevent us from seeing something, like it is in China. Our big fear is surveillance, right? So the government kind of says, all right, you can do whatever you want, but we're going to be watching, right? One of the things Edward Snowden is on the run from is exposing to the United States the kind of broad nature of how the United States government is looking at the communications of its citizens. And the government has a right to look at communications of its citizens with a signed and specific warrant. But when they start doing it without that signed and specific warrant, that becomes a human rights violation. And that becomes very troubling and very concerning. And the fear of that government surveillance is censorship, right? When people don't say and do and communicate things because they fear that government surveillance, that is censorship. So the last thing we're going to talk about is pornography, because you can't talk about censorship without talking about porn. Porn is this huge, monumentally gigantic business in the world today. And there's a lot of really big debate and controversy over pornography, right? It's just kind of the publication of sex. And it sounds really simple, but it's become this really complex, weird thing. And feminism has been a really big movement all throughout the 20th century into the 21st century. Women want equal social, political, and economic rights as men, right? They want to have that same amount of access to those three areas: the social, the political, and the economic. They want the same level of access. And that's really important, I think, right? But this feminism, this movement, is really of two minds about porn, which I think is really interesting. There's a lot of feminists who really like porn because porn is sexual expression and freedom and women being comfortable in their own bodies, and sex is a natural thing and we should be celebrating it because it's wonderful. Everybody likes sex. We should, hey, pornography is great. It allows, it's one of the few fields in which women get paid a lot more than men. We should all be more comfortable in our own bodies. We should all be more comfortable about sex. Pornography is great. And then there's the other side within this one feminist group that says, no, porn is exploitation. Porn is essentially violence against women. It is a artifact, a depiction of the very male-dominated society put into physical action, and then obviously either video or picture representation, right? So pornography reinforces this view that women are for sex, women are sex objects, women are good for doing these horrible things too, and that's kind of how women should be. And these two different diametrically opposed views within this feminism movement have been kind of disagreeing with each other for a long time about this. And it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out as the internet becomes even more accessible, right? Because not only do we have computers now, but we've got cell phones and we've got tablets, and everything is connected to the internet, which means essentially as technology goes, there goes pornography. So as it gets more and more accessible, how does the feelings about pornography differ and change? But essentially, the fight about pornography is about the public versus the private, right? Because sex is kind of the ultimate private thing in society, right? It's what people, you get socialized from birth to think that, sex and anything to do with sex should be hidden. Never go outside without clothing. If you're going to have sex, you need to do it behind closed doors. You can't let anybody watch or hear you. That's, sex. And, your genitalia is private, and you don't show that to anybody. And, but if it's that private, does the government have the right to regulate it? When we take that private thing and take it into the public space, what level of going from private to public is the point where the state should come in and intervene and say, okay, no, you can't do that, right? So if we're watching pornography in our own homes by ourselves, there's nobody else around, there's no kids around, you know, obviously, does the government have the right to control what we're doing in that private space, right? But the UK has recently passed and is, as of this recording, about to enact a law that says porn on any internet service in the country is blocked by default. And if you're a British citizen and you want porn, you have to go through a positive process to unlock it, right? So you have to prove you're over 18. Like there's a thing you can do where you can put in like a passport number or a credit card number or I can't remember all the different ways you can do it, but there are multiple different ways you can kind of prove you're over 18, and then that will unblock the porn, right? So whereas in the United States, everybody's kind of assumed to be 18, and if you want your under 18 kids to not have porn, you have to block it yourself. It's kind of an opt-out policy. In the UK, they're switching over to an opt-in policy, where if you want porn, by default it's blocked, and you have to go in and get it unblocked through the government system. Does that make sense? All right. That's the end of our section on censorship. I hope you guys are kind of enjoying this and kind of learned something and have kind of examined your own views about censorship. And we will return soon with the next subject.